Exposure is one of the fundamental terms in photography. There's much to discuss about exposure, which is why this short presentation is part one. Exposure is the amount of light that reaches our camera's sensor, and getting the right exposure can be a challenge. Overexposure can lead to super bright highlights with no detail and faded, washed out looking images. Underexposed images can be dark and hard to see. Remember this? VSAX? We will revisit VSAX for you at some point in the future, but for this session, we're just going to be touching upon the S and the A. And for the S, select modes, we will just touch upon three elements. In fact, in this session, we will not go into detail regarding image quality. We'll just say we are shooting JPEG, and we'll set the white balance to auto. More about those in part 2. For our purpose here, let's select A for aperture priority. This choice, as would be the case with shutter priority and program mode, means I have given a lot of control over to the camera for exposing the image. My job is to compose and focus the shot. The camera does the calculations for getting me the right exposure. Sounds straightforward, right? Well, those calculations are based upon our old friend, the exposure triangle. Now, understanding this is crucial. It is the relationship between shutter speed, aperture, and ISO that creates the right exposure for an image. As a refresher, let's remind ourselves what each of these three components are all about. The shutter is typically made of a two-section cover for your sensor. When the shutter button is pressed, it moves the cover to expose the sensor to the light traveling through the lens. The shutter speed determines the time allowed for light to hit the sensor. 1/4000th of a second is very fast, 1/8 of a second is quite slow, 1 second even slower, and so on. Here's a graphic to help visualize this. So here's our sensor, ready to receive the light, and that light will translate to digital data. The cover is a two-section piece of metal or plastic, and they are often referred to as curtains. When we press the shutter release button, the first or front curtain reveals the sensor, exposing it to the light. The second or rear curtain then follows. The gap between the front and the rear curtain is determined by the shutter speed set. As we said, a 1/4000th of a second speed means the rear curtain follows almost immediately after the front curtain. A shutter speed set at 1/8 means a longer time between the two curtains and therefore a longer exposure. The exposure is completed once the rear curtain fully covers the sensor. The shutter speed is a great ally in capturing movement. It can be a fast speed to freeze the action or a slower speed to show motion by blurring parts of the subject. An example here could be a bird's face is sharp but the wings are blurred to represent its flapping. So shutter is all about time allowed for light to hit the sensor. But how much light? Sometimes we need a lot of light to capture the scene to our liking. This is where aperture becomes our ally. Aperture is all about the quantity of light allowed to hit the sensor whilst the shutter has exposed it. On DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, apertures and the settings of them are found in the lenses. As the diagram on the right here illustrates, the lower the number, or f-stop as we call it, the wider the aperture and therefore more light hits the sensor. As an aside, lenses with the widest and most open apertures such as 1.4 or 2.8 are usually among the most expensive lenses. The creative impact of a wide aperture is a shallower depth of field. And by depth of field, we mean the distance between the closest and the farthest objects in a photo that appear defined or perceived as sharp. This allows us to include or isolate our main subject from the background and sometimes foreground. The third element of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is all about the level of sensitivity to light. We adjust the ISO to influence that sensitivity of the sensor. A low number setting like 50 is not very sensitive. 25,600 is extremely sensitive to light. It's worth noting that the aesthetic of our final image may well be influenced by the ISO setting. The higher the ISO, the higher levels of grain or noise may be present in the image. At this point, I feel it's important to mention the terminology used related to exposure. We use the term stops. You'll hear Ali and me mention this often. A stop is the doubling or halving the amount of light hitting the sensor. An example. If our camera shutter speed is set at 1/250th of a second and we adjust the speed to a faster 1/500th, we have halved the exposure time by 1 stop. If we had changed it further to 1/1000th of a second, we have decreased exposure by 2 stops, even less time for the light to hit the sensor. If we had started at 1/1000th of a second and changed it to the slower 1/500th, we would have increased exposure by 1 stop. Similarly, if our aperture is set at f8 and then changed to f11, we have stopped down by 1 stop. We have halved the amount of light hitting the sensor. If we adjusted it to f16, we have stopped down by 2 stops, halved again. If we started at f11 and then changed to f8, we would have widened or opened up by 1 stop, doubling the amount of light allowed to hit the sensor. These are the common terms used related to exposure. Now, our cameras make their exposure calculations in those auto modes using these 3 components, but they are based on photometry, or metering as we call it. Our cameras have built-in metering systems. Here are 3 typical core metering modes to understand. The first mode is often the default mode and is called different names by different brands. Matrix metering for Nikon, evaluative for Canon, average metering for Sony, multi-zone for Panasonic, ESP for Olympus, and so on. It measures the light levels within the 5 key areas of the frame. The second mode is called center weighted, typically universally known as center weighted. This mode measures the light of the entire frame, but gives more weight to the area towards the center of the frame. The third mode for metering is called spot metering, and it meters the light mainly around a very small area of the frame, typically the center, which measures around just 5% of the entire frame. Depending on which mode you have selected for metering, the camera will then make its calculations for what it sees as a perfect exposure. It's not a subjective decision because it's working out how it can achieve that exposure value equivalent to 18% grey. When you first worked with us, you would have heard us talk about this. All cameras strive to produce an image that has an average exposure of 18% grey. It sees everything in black and white and looks for the midpoint. It sees this beautiful scene like this. It sees this coastal scene like this, and sees this portrait like this. In fact, it's trying to produce this. It's trying to create a histogram shape like this, but more on that in part 2. But when we hand the control over to our cameras by using auto modes, there are consequences for the aesthetics of the image it produces. This was a vibrant scene I saw and wanted to capture. The camera took this. It's perfectly exposed, except it's dull and actually looks underexposed. This lovely white snow scene with a colourful bird looks fab. But the metering said there is too much brightness here, so let's reduce the exposure to get back to the 18% grey. Consequently, our snow looks blue/grey, and the whole image looks underexposed. This portrait against a dark background looks good, but when left to the camera's meter, it says there is too much black in the frame and therefore we need to expose for more light to achieve the 18%. And we get this. It's an overexposed face, a less pleasant image, and certainly not saleable if this was for a paying customer. There is some good news here though. If our camera is set to P program mode, or aperture priority mode, or shutter priority mode, we can use the helpful function called exposure compensation. The bad news is it doesn't work on any other settings other than P, A, and S. So let's see an example using aperture priority. A view of the Wye River from Simmons Yacht. Using a lens set at 24mm focal length, the camera was set at f11, that's the aperture, with an ISO at 400, the sensitivity of the sensor. The metering was in matrix mode. That's measuring the light from the 5 major areas of the frame. To achieve 18% grey exposure value, the camera recommended the shutter speed at 1/320th of a second. As seen here, the image was underexposed. It certainly was a brighter day than this. I needed more light. I moved the exposure compensation dial to +1, which slowed the shutter speed, which in turn allowed light to hit the sensor for longer. It brightened the image and was much closer to what I was looking for in reality. As a shadow moved across the scene, I made a further tweak to the exposure compensation dial and slowed the shutter even further to 1/125th of a second, allowing the sensor to receive the light for a fraction longer. I was happy with the image captured, and with a few adjustments in Lightroom, I ended up with this pleasing image. But sometimes we are faced with more extreme lighting conditions. Very bright skies, dark landscapes. Sometimes a single exposure, even with exposure compensation, will struggle to produce results that look like what we see. Remember, our eyes are really good at adjusting. To help with such exposure challenges, we can turn to a technique called bracketing. This is where we may take a series of photos of the same scene, but alter the settings. This is best achieved when using a tripod, or at least with the camera in a fixed position. Here's a good example. For this, I used a range of 3 stops for my shutter speeds. When asked by a client to photograph their room, we can see there are very high contrast areas of light. The lights and the windows stand out. So my first exposure is to expose for the light areas. I want them bright but not blown out. The second exposure was slightly brighter. This was closer to the camera's recommended exposure value. But then the third exposure was for the darker areas, the chairs, and the bits in between. You can now see how overexposed those lights and windows look in the other parts of the image. In Lightroom, I merged all 3 images together to produce this, and it's a good image to then do a final edit. This was the final image, and it met with approval from the client, who was looking for that cozy, warm Cotswold feel. Understanding the exposure triangle is a fundamental to our control over exposure. Generating the right exposure for the images we want to create requires knowledge, understanding, and lots of practice. It can elevate our photographs from a simple record to something truly eye-catching. In part 2, we shall build upon these basics and explore more around the fundamental term of exposure, all to understand, enhance, and enjoy our photographic experiences.